So welcome to the audience, welcome to our panel. I just name you and will introduce you before you finally start to talk. So welcome Representative Katalin Gennburg from the House of Representatives, Abgeordnetenhaus in Berlin. Berlin is a federal state as well as a city, so the House of Representatives is the Parliament of Berlin. Welcome Representative Assemblywoman Phara Souffrant Forrest from the New York State Assembly. And welcome Joanna Kusiak from the Deutsche Wohnen and enteignen. That's just the name of the movement behind the referendum for the socialization of the big real estate companies in Berlin, which is the reason why we have this panel today. One further housekeeping remark. We will start with presentations from Joanna and Katalin and a comment from Phara, followed by a comment from Phara. And then we will go into a conversation, and that will be the moment where the audience also can pose questions. I invite you to write your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay, this on September 27th, the Berliners not just elected a new national parliament and a new state parliament, but also had the possibility to vote on a referendum, which demanded to socialize housing or real estate companies that own more than a certain amount of apartments. We will just talk about the reasons in a minute, but the result was overwhelming. It was 56.4% of the people who voted decided in favor, which is really a great result and much more than any party in the elections, any single party in the elections that took place at the same time got. So it's really a big result. And the new government that is now about to be formed in Berlin, which will be a coalition of the Social Democratic Party, kind of progressive, the Green Party, and the LINKE, the left party in Berlin, and which continues the coalition that governed the city before, will have to deal with this result. This is kind of surprising when we talk to our American audience. How is this possible? Well, it's a forgotten article in the German constitution that allows the socialization or nationalization, if you want to say it, of important industries in favor of the common good. This article has, as far as I remember, never been triggered before until the movement Deutsche Wohnen and enteignen brought it up. Deutsche Wohnen is one of the big real estate companies that own some 100,000 of apartments in Berlin, and one of the real driving forces behind the raise of the rents in Berlin at the moment. And that was the point. And I think I leave it by that and give Joanna the chance to explain it a bit better. So Joanna, you're representing the movement and to speak for the initiative Deutsche Wohnen and enteignen that finally initiated this referendum. So tell us, how did it all happen? How did it start and where did it go?
Thank you, and good morning, New York. I mean, I don't see the participant, but I can imagine the vibe. I actually just thought I lived in New York exactly 10 years ago. And as I lived there, I attended the Boston meeting of Right to the City Network, where urban movements from the whole US came. And I remember the amazing energy. So it is actually nice memory now talking from here, from Berlin, about our urban movements, to have this energy that I experienced 10 years ago in mind. Now, I have a task to summarize our story in 10 minutes, so I'll do my best. And of course, I will elaborate on it in questions specifically in relation to what you're interested in. But just to start with, to give some context, especially when one also what is the situation of the housing crisis in Berlin, and from which moment of this housing crisis our movement started. I think it's important to say that Berlin is a tenant city, is a renter city. So 85% of the city is rental, which means, and it's politically, of course, important, that tenants represent all political options, all classes, all social classes, or all nationalities. So this is an identity that spans over many other identities, and definitely that has been important in fostering a broad connection. And also Berlin, having this identity, has a very long history of urban tenant movements that date back actually to 19th century, so which is where officially the first tenant initiative in Berlin started. And there's been a whole spectrum operating within the law, extra-legal, squatters. I mean, throughout over a century of activity, of course, there's been a lot of different iterations of urban activism. And throughout this decades of urban activists, especially if one looks at Berlin from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, from London, from New York, or from Canada, Australian cities, the starting point is that we do have a reasonable tenant protection laws in comparison to this Anglo countries. Like most contracts are cannot be terminated, they're open-ended, and there's a set of legal rules according to which when you could as a landlord raise the rent. So you would think that we start from a fairly good position, especially comparatively. And there's been also a tradition of the legal defense, of using law as a defense. We have also in Berlin legal tenant associations that, if you remember, offer also legal insurance, a very important tool, because if you get into conflict with your landlord, they would cover the costs of the lawyer and the cost of the court proceedings, even in case you lose, which is important because that allows also structurally weaker actors, like people who wouldn't afford a lawyer, are not educated, or would fear to engage in a legal conflict, to operate this way. So throughout the years, you would think that the situation was fairly reasonable, which doesn't mean that there wasn't contestation and there wasn't rising rents. But then the real game changer was the appearance of this new type of landlord, which is not the classical Berlin landlord, which is usually like a physical person, a small company that would own 1, 2, 3 houses in Berlin. But in 2000s, a lot of Berlin housing, the whole portfolios, in fact, were privatized and by the back then government as part of the austerity politics. I mean, typical austerity politics, which I think is globally well known to everyone by now, just trying to overcome the deficit by quickly selling out public goods. But they were privatized not like in UK to the tenants. It wasn't a right to buy. The whole portfolios, big portfolios of housing, were privatized to hedge funds that then in a series of transactions ultimately turned into stock listed corporations. And as a landlord, such a stock listed corporation is a completely, well, it was a game changer, negative game changer for the tenants. And there's several reasons for that. I mean, and with that, housing was not just privatized, but also financialized. So that's the moment in Berlin where housing becomes an object of financial speculation, which again, financialization of housing is a global problem. It definitely occurs in New York as well, as you know, but that is historically the moment when it started in Berlin. And these financialized landlords, they are structurally different from regular landlords because the tenant is not the client, even within this framework of capitalism, where, you know, if you have a classical landlord, the tenant is a sort of client. With the financial corporation, the actual client is always the shareholder, which means structurally tenants are just means to an end of upping the revenue from the capital. And it means therefore that no matter what is the demographic logic on the housing markets, these companies will do everything they can to up the rents and lower maintenance costs. And this combined with the fact that there has been actual demographic pressure on Berlin, plus very aggressive politics of saving of maintenance costs, upping the rents, plus the sheer scale effect, because even if there were some legal protection mechanism in place, again, these corporations, they have completely different power. So they have their own legal departments where you have top and very well paid lawyers whose basically sole day job is to find loopholes in the tenant law. And also by virtue of their scale, they can manipulate the regulatory benchmarks. For example, we have a benchmark called Rent Mirror, Mietspiegel, which is an average rent from a given area. And if a company like Deutsche Wohnen has 100,000 apartments in Berlin, if they raise the rent, they effectively manipulate the whole benchmark, therefore also allowing for further increase of rents. So this was the moment where urban movements realized that if we try to address this problem only by coming up with the new regulations within the domain of the tenant laws, we will always be in the defensive. It will be like a cat and mouse game. We can come up with a new regulation, but then they will come up with the new way of going around this regulation, and they will always be quicker because they are hired to do so, or they're paid to do so, whereas the activists and tenants are doing it basically in their spare time and out of necessity. So that was this idea crystallized that we have to address the problem at its root, which is the property relation, which is the very fact that this financialized corporation should not own housing, housing should not be object of financial speculation. And then someone mentioned this Article 15 of the German Constitution, which is a clause that was historically never ever used. So not even lawyers, in some sense, they didn't remember it's there. I mean, it was there all the time. The Constitution didn't change since it was written in 1949. But, and there in this article, it says that land, natural resources, and means of production could be socialized for the purpose of, it's a little bit tautological, actually. It's a very German formulation. They say could be socialized for the purpose of socialization, which means for the purpose of common good. And first, when I will explain in a moment what does it mean. But first, when some activists mention it, even among the activists, the first impression was like, oh, this is a great idea, but this is too radical. This is not going to work. So there was a core group that was, let's try it. And the first response, even among this activist milieu, was like, that's great, fantastic, but not really realistic. But then, you know, those people who were importantly, I think, also not lawyers, these were not lawyers that initially came up with this legal strategy. They developed it a little bit and they brought it to lawyers. And again, lawyers were surprised to say like, wow, actually, you're right, this can work, but we would never think about it. So I think sometimes it takes this outsider perspective of precisely not, especially that law is such a expert domain that really guards itself from the outside. And sometimes it does take a good outsider to have a fresh look at the opportunities that that law allows. So just I say a little bit more about this Article 15, and then we can move to the question. So this clause was it's a historically very interesting clause, because the whole German constitution was written in 1949, so it was completely different political situation. Unprecedented numbers of legislators who were writing the constitution had their own history of being politically persecuted or even being refugees, because this was just after Nazi times. And importantly, also they still had in a fresh memory the ways in which big German industry helped Hitler in his rise to power in the 30s. So even in conservative parties, I mean, the idea of socialization was supported right to left. Of course, there were still, you know, the left side was trying to radicalize it. The conservative side was trying to keep it less radical. But the basic consensus that it's a reasonable idea to have a tool within the German constitution that allows the state to limit economic power in a situation where this accumulation of economic power by certain groups becomes dangerous for democracy or dangerous for common good, was back then a consensus. And therefore the German constitution is also interesting as a metric to see how much we moved, how much we neoliberalized, because the idea that back then was kind of a mainstream accepted by also conservative, now when we put it in the game, was perceived as this kind of completely radical and off the top, like, wow, I mean, revolutionary game changer. And always when as a spokesperson, when I was presented with this argument, this is socialism, you know it in US, surely you know, this is socialism, my default response is, this idea is only as socialist as the German constitution itself. I mean, not an inch more. And the idea was double. I mean, was to use this legal tool that definitely allow us to leverage the legitimacy of law for this very radical idea and help us to protect this idea from being dismissed, because it's much harder to dismiss the German constitution and say, oh, this is just some sort of radical communist fantasy. But at the same time, we knew we needed political mobilization, and for that we decided for the tool of referendum, which is in a way the strongest tool of direct democracy, and which Berlin had lots of experience with before. I mean, by virtue of public referendum, we in Berlin managed to re-municipalize waterworks after they were privatized, to protect an old airport, Tempelhof, from becoming developed, and to protect it as a sort of open public park, and so on and so on. So there was a know-how from the previous initiative. And with this, what we proposed was, one could say provocatively, some sort of nationalization from the grassroots up. So, but with the caveat that it's not nationalization, because it's not about creating a state structure that is managed like a private company. The idea of the socialization is really not just the ownership, not just that this housing would be publicly owned, but also that the public company that manages this housing has to be democratically managed and participatorily managed. So there's this idea of, in some sense, it would be a true realization of so-called shared economy, but not in this perverted capitalist way where you have someone using the common good for the very private benefit, but really sharing the ownership of this housing and sharing the responsibility of the management of this housing. So throughout the whole period of mobilization, we managed to win the referendum, and I will finish there. It's not just the percentage of votes, but also the absolute numbers. We got over 1 million votes. So this is unprecedented success, and the statistics also show that our supporters came from across political spectrum, from all political parties. We were specifically also especially supported by the LINKE, and Katalin certainly tell more about it. But when it comes to actual voters, we really managed to go beyond political tribes and camps and really mobilize across many different groups. So that's been definitely a success.
Thank you, Joanna. That was really well explained, I think, and also for me, it really brought all the memories back, because it was a long process when I was, and it started when I was still in Berlin. So really, really amazing, great success, as you said, and congratulations on that. I mean, I can congratulate myself because I also voted in favor of the referendum. Now let's come to Katalin. Katalin Gennburg is member of the Abgeordnetenhaus, the House of Representatives of Berlin, for die Linke, the left party, just re-elected. Congratulations to you too. So she's in this, and she's spokesperson for city planning, is something like that. Is that correct? Yeah. And as I said, Social Democrats, Greens, and Die Linke just negotiated about the formation of a new city government. And it is not a secret that the party, the Social Democratic Party, and especially the person that is to be elected, the new mayor, was never in favor of the socialization of the big real estate companies. So how did you deal with that in the negotiations? What is the approach of Die Linke, and how do you think it will go on with the result of the referendum? Katalin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. First of all, yeah, thank you for the invitation, and hello to New York and wherever. And yeah, I would like to tell you a bit about the perspective of the left party here in Berlin. As a socialist party, we have this special situation in Germany that we have a socialist party coming originally from the eastern part of Germany, and the Social Democrats, which is not a socialist party anymore, as you may know. So this is maybe has to be said before. And yeah, I remember very good the beginning of the referendum in 2017, when it all started and when the first ideas of this referendum came into place. And it's now a big success of the housing movement in Berlin, that they organized such a big success, and there has to be said a lot about how this success was possible. But what I can tell you is now the perspective of the left party, and I'm responsible in the left party in the House of Representatives for urban development, more or less, and I supported this referendum from the beginning. Because this has to be said, the left party in Berlin has a very special history in terms of the housing politics, because our former party, the PDS, which was the party before Die Linke was founded, our former party was part of a government in Berlin that had to sell, or was part of a government that sold a lot of houses, as Joanna already said. And this is like a really big mistake in our for our socialist party in this history of the city, that in the past years created a lot of problems in the housing sector, and is definitely part of the housing crisis that we are facing now. Because this is all what Joanna already said. We know about the financialization of the housing sector and the financial crisis that brought a big boost to this housing crisis as well, and that we have now a situation that a lot of our houses are in the hands of big stock-oriented housing companies that only want to make profit out of our homes. This is like the basis, but it was not all bad. So when our former party governed in Berlin in the early 2000er years, it was a big thing that our party was brought the possibility of direct democracy into the Berlin Constitution. So that it is possible to make referendums now in Berlin is definitely one of the successes of the government in that time. That was definitely a left success from our party. And these instruments of referendum were used a lot of times until now, but it was almost used from the housing movement. And as Joanna said, there was also a referendum on the rent regulation in the housing companies, the communal housing companies that are owned by the Berlin state. And after that, we had now the referendum on the expropriation of these big companies. And this is, for me as a socialist, not a very new thing, not a very new debate, because I'm now a member of my party since 20 years. And since that time, I know Andreas, I think, and I know very good that we had always a discussion about this article. There was always like the discussion of, okay, our constitution does not provide capitalism. It is open for different ways of society, and what we can that we can change society, and so change the system. So now that this initiative brought the article in our reality is like a really good thing, because if the city asks for expropriation, I think it's clear that we cannot, as a left party, say we don't want to, or we are not able to, or something like that. So when the initiative started in 2017, I remember there were, of course, a lot of people saying, okay, this sounds a bit crazy, and this is maybe not the right way to go. And it was, of course, a bit far away from our very concrete problems. When we started in 2016 in the government as a left, green, red government, we had huge problems of the housing crisis, and a lot of people lost their homes, and we had like these huge housing companies that were not giving a shit on the rent regulation, and making that the rent prices are going higher and higher. That was a situation in 2016 and 17, and in that time, the referendum started, and there were some people in our party, me and others, who supported this initiative from the early beginning. And then in 2018, we had our Congress of the party, and we brought in a proposal to support Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, and this proposal was successful. The whole Congress, only one vote was not in favor of the proposal, but the whole Congress voted to support this referendum. This was in 2018. And then in 2019, in April, the collecting of signatures of the initiative started. And we said as a party, okay, we not only want to say we are in favor of this initiative, we really want to support the initiative. We want to go make action. And we decided to have the goal to collect 10,000 signatures for 20,000 signatures that were needed, but the initiative in general, all in all, collected 70,000 signatures for the first step. This was the first stage of the referendum in 2019. And we as the Left Party were very happy that we organized 10,000 and more signatures to, yes, really support the initiative, because the other parties that were part of the government, like the Greens and the Social Democrats, said, no, we don't want to support the initiative because we don't want confrontation, we want cooperation with these private investors, and we need like to talk and whatever. So there was, from the beginning of the initiative, there was a concrete difference between the three governing parties, us really supporting the initiatives and the others saying, no, this is crazy and we this is not the way we want to solve the problem. In that time, and this is very important to say, we implemented as well the Berlin Mietendeckel, the rent cap that you may know as well. That is unfortunately not there anymore, because the Constitutional Court said it is not allowed for Berlin to make a rent regulation on the local level, on the state level. And so they stopped our law, but this law was a big thing when we implemented this rent regulation. We had like a big support of the city and the movement as well. But at the same time, honestly, there was also a discussion, people saying, okay, now you want to make this rent cap to prevent the success of the referendum on the expropriation. For us as the Left Party, I can say, truly say, this was never the idea, this was never the intention. I was very invited and engaged in the Mietendeckel, in the rent cap regulation, and this was, but this is like I wanted to tell. There were like, of course, a dynamic for the Social Democrats to support the rent regulation of the Mietendeckel law in Berlin, take out the power of the or the energy for the referendum and the support of the referendum on the expropriation. So there was like a concurrence, and there was, of course, a big discussion that maybe if we have the rent cap, we don't need really the expropriation. But for us as a Socialist Party, it was totally clear we want both, because we want to regulate the rents now, but we also really think that we need different owner structures of housing as a common good, as a public good. And we need to change the system of the ownership of housing, and we need to take away these houses that were sold many, many years to the private market and that are now in the hands of big speculators. And so we supported the movement. We were always working very close to the movement. We had in our board in the Berlin, on the Berlin level of the Left Party, we had two members of our party that were all the time engaged in the initiative. They were part of the initiative. And we had, of course, many of our comrades were engaged in the initiative at these all the time. So we made many events, discussions, and this, of course, brought to us a highly mobilization for the party, and of course a new discourse on how to what is left politics, actually, what is socialist politics in times of financialization. So this is really I'm really happy and I'm very glad about that the initiative really make sure, okay, we really want you to get into this discourse, to talk with us about what is left housing politics in times of financialization. So let's say now we are having this successful initiative and this referendum, and we are now stipulating for a new coalition. we have a coalition contract that has to be voted for from our party members the next 10 days. So we are in the middle of the voting process. I'm responsible for the part of housing and city development. I was part of the coalition group, and I'm now not very in favor of the coalition contract. This is like really a big discussion what's going on now, if we have to vote for or against the coalition contract. But what I want to say about the things stipulated for the referendum is that we want to make a commission that has to find ways to make a law that will make sure that the socialization of the big housing companies will take place. And this is like a process we stipulated on with the Greens and the Social Democrats now for the coalition contract, that we will have this commission in the next 1.5 years. And so even if we are part of the government or not, we will definitely fight for the referendum and for the socialization of these big housing companies. And we have to make sure that, it is also still the question of who owns the city and who pays for the city. And this is a question of a matter of class struggle. So of course we will fight for this idea, and we will see if our party votes for the coalition contract or not. And then we have to go further for the idea of the socialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Katalin. It seems like the fight is not over yet. It's not done. But we will talk about that in some minutes. But first, before that, I would like to give the floor to Representative Phara Souffrant Forrest. She's member of the New York State Assembly, representing the 57th district in Brooklyn, actually where I live. And besides that, she's also active in the Crown Heights Tenant Union, and she helped to pass the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act 2019. So yeah, curious to hear, what do you take from this, from what I heard right now? So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Andreas. I'm glad to have you here, over here in Brooklyn. I'm going to practice my little German. Guten Tag allerseits. Okay. Hello, hello. I am super excited to be here because I know that I was invited to make commentary, but I am here to learn from the success that Berlin, more importantly, the success of the people of Berlin to come together both in the legislature, as tenants, and workers who are all working to make sure that Berlin, the seat of Germany, works for people. And so I definitely see that there are some commonalities between New York City and the struggle that is going on in Berlin. I think the first thing is this idea of who are we fighting against? I mean, at the end of the day, when we look at New York City, you know, if we're all here together and we're living together, there shouldn't really be a problem, but there are clear enemies of the working class, the 99% of New York State, the 8 million people who make New York City work. There is an enemy. And we had a governor that has been so stuck on austerity. Joanna talked about austerity, this air of we cannot move on because we work on so little. And we there's nothing else. I mean, we have one pie. Think of it as that everyone is fighting over one pie. But when we talk about a city that has the GDP that equals other nations, that really is that's a false narrative. And so that is one. We have a governor we had a governor that was pushing this false narrative of austerity in every form. And then we still have a New York City that is run by real estate developers, similar to what we were talking, that was mentioned before, this corporate landlord. It isn't mom and pops, where even the people who are regular people that cannot afford, that cannot maintain their homes. I'm a nurse by trade, and I remember when I first was coming out of school, my mom was like, well, you have to buy a little house in Canarsie. That was the goal. Like, buy a little house in Canarsie and you're going to be a little homeowner, and that's what you do. You know, you become a nurse and then you work and you get a little house, you have a little family, a little picnic here, a little picnic there, you're good. But that was impossible when you're in the face of not only labor that's not really centered on workers, but then a housing industry that does not value people in it. And one thing also I wanted to mention, we talked about benchmarks, right? And like when this big corporation came in and bought up the housings, I think it was 500, they were trying to buy 500,000 units at once. I think that was the story I was hearing. But this idea that now they raise the benchmarks for the house, like the market, right? The same thing is happening here, where you have this adjusted median income, where, you know, if you're raising the rents, then the AMI, the adjusted median income, goes up. Then people who wanted to get affordable housing, the little housing stock that is left, is now unaffordable because you don't meet that income due to the influx of new higher incomes into the area. So even like the way that we even tried to protect our housing stocks was faulty and antiquated. And so while I love Berlin in the sense that you guys are so far ahead in terms of even baking in a exit clause to capitalism, which we do not have in the States. But we did have a fight, you know, we did fought back against this austerity, this movement towards capitalizing the universal good of housing, right? We under the Rent Stabilization Act in 2019. Now, at the time, I was a little student. I was a student nurse, and then I became a nurse, and I was a housing activist by teaching people know your rights about how to read your lease and how to learn, you know, about your rights around housing. Your landlord can't harass you. But then I took it higher with the Housing Justice for All coalition, Housing Justice for All coalition across New York State, where, you know, at the beginning, I was just, you know, on the bottom here, helping people make tenant associations, but now I am leading people who are organized to Albany so that we can complete our cause there. And mobilizing people to basically for this historic win. I mean, when June 4th, I believe the day was, when we went up to Albany and got arrested in the halls of the Albany, where the assembly, we call it the People's House, where people are getting arrested in the People's House, demanding that people in the house listen. That was amazing. And so the next day, the act was passed. There has been some pushback. Of course, there's always going to be pushback, but I think even after, during the pandemic, one part of the act that was left out was called the Good Cause Eviction Bill, which would not only protect people who are in this protected housing, but protected housing stock, rent stabilization and rent control, but then extend it to market rate. And that is the battle. And we see that more than ever, that people who are in market rate apartments need to be protected. And at some point, you know, when we're saying, you know, hashtag cancel rent, a lot of people were thinking, oh, that's pretty radical, that's pretty left, that's too left. But when we really see what does that mean, cancel the rent, meaning that we cancel the profit motive on people's lives and instead focus on the business of housing should be housing people. And so it shouldn't matter who can afford $2,400 or $3,000 for housing. At the end of the day, everybody is gonna get a house, homes guaranteed. So that's the fight. And then we also is gonna take it to the next level. One of the things that we talked about was getting ahead of the game, the cat and mouse game, right? Getting ahead of the real estate developers thinking how to outwit us. Well, if we really then take this idea of public trust, right? We have this fight that we're fighting with our biggest. In New York City, we have one of the largest public housing developments called New York City Housing Authority, and with over 500,000 residents, and so it is in a state of almost bankruptcy, I guess you could call it bankrupt. They don't have money to maintain itself. And so everybody wants to pull out in terms of the state and the feds, but we say, no. Again, we're not going to follow the trend of privatizing our most precious good, which is housing for people. And so we have an option, which is called the Preservation Trust. Basically, it will be people at the board, at the trust, the board of trustees, I guess what you could call it, is going to be made of people from the residents, people who are elected, choosing people to be on the board, which holds it a public accountability. It would be then using bonds against the money that, of course, is going to come in from the government, and then using that to incentivize people to invest into NYCHA, which is, of course, a public good. I think that's a way, we don't have a clause yet. The US Constitution is very difficult to change, but maybe that's one way that we can create an example for other municipalities to use that, or even expand upon that, to create and preserve, mostly preserve affordable housing stock, but then to create a mechanism to increase our housing stock. Because once you have the market coming in and seeing the value and investing in the value of public good, right, versus taking out the public good and using it for, to increase their pockets, then we would see that there is an incentive in creating housing for people. There is an incentive. We don't have to extract. In fact, we benefit the most when we invest in ourselves and in the people who make the city work. I'm really, really excited for this, for the possibility of NYCHA, the Preservation Trust. Public doesn't mean bad. I think one thing I will say with the US is public sounds so bad. Public schools, public assistance, when you're on food stamps is bad. I went to public schools. I have been on food stamps. I have received public Medicaid, which is our public health care. If you see this beautiful teeth, public assistance has done it. But that means that, with the right guidance, with the right people who are invested, this can turn our communities for the better. It's not bad to be public. And so I think this is for our New York City folks. I know people in Berlin got this, but for our New York City people, it's not bad to be public. And so we will be looking, I know I will be looking towards Berlin for examples to continue this fight, but also there is much collaboration in the left. It's international. The left has to organize across nations to understand that we have to come together. Yes, wrap it up. Yes. Thank you. Done. My friend on the side is helping me.
You're muted.
I see. After all this time. So thank you very much. That was really great also to draw the parallels and see what the fights, the struggles have in common on both sides of the Atlantic. We have now 10 minutes left, so I would skip a point that I plan to do to give the chance to comment on each other or ask each other questions, because we already got some questions from Rita Silva from the Housing Movement in Portugal. Actually, it is a lot of questions. All of them are really interesting. Thank you for them, Rita. And I think I will just read them out and include one of my questions, and then give Joanna and Katalin the possibility to answer them, and then hopefully we have time for a short round of closing remarks. That's the plan for the remaining 10 minutes. Rita is asking, what are the discussions among with SPD and Greens, what they would like to do? That's probably a question for Katalin, sorry. And how are they managing this? What is the reaction of the landlords? I think both of you can answer that. How are they, and how are you prepare? How are they preparing themselves for this after this result? Are they scared? For sure. And are there influences on a federal level? I would like also to elaborate a bit, would like you to elaborate a bit further on the question. You said that many people said it is an impossible thing, and it was, I know there was a big reluctance in the broad audience in Berlin about this proposal. So how did you work on the mobilization, maybe both the movement and the party? How did you encourage people really to say, yes, we want to take the housing in the public hands? Joanna?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I would start, because I mentioned to Andreas before, actually in 10 minutes, I start another meeting, and I'm relatively unwilling to be late, because it's a meeting of the initiative where we have to discuss how we're going to deal with this question of the commission working on the law. So it's really like a hot political topic, and I just need to be there to ask all the new questions and not just answer the old ones. So just to give you a little overview of a mobilization technique, I think because I think all the political questions that Katalin is actually really good, well placed also inside this discussion to answer them probably better than me. We used a range of strategies, and I think what was particularly source of our success was this combination of legal struggle with classical political struggle. So in some sense, I like to say that our movement managed in a paradoxical yet very successful way to be both anti-systemic and pro-systemic at the same time. Anti-systemic because this is a very, and when I say pro-systemic, I will explain in a moment what I mean. Anti-systemic because it's obviously a very radical proposition that really breaks with the financialization of housing. It breaks with the neoliberal normal and so on. At the same time, this was not only a protest movement, and this is, I mean, it's mirrored in these two words that we're using. We're using the word expropriation for the purpose of political campaign, but actually what we propose is not expropriation, but socialization, which is this different legal term coming from the Article 15. And this decision, to use a legal tool that is very pro-systemic in the sense it comes from within the system, and it not only negates something, but also proposes something. It's not just expropriating these big landlords, it's also proposing a model for a new institution, how this housing should be managed, how the new system should look like. So it's not just a negative protest movement, it's a political proposition that in a sense also masks itself by this negative claim of expropriation, because also it's not a secret that it is easier to organize people against an enemy, while at the same time it's not enough to organize people against enemy. It's crucial to actually propose something new. And I think these two aspects of it were definitely source of our success. The second was this leveraging the legitimacy of law to work for advantage. And in this way also we managed to, for example, effectively outsource the legal discussion, because once we made those claims and we became a lot of media attention, this were political parties, institutions, think tanks that started actually ordering all this expensive legal expertise to check is it possible or not. And most of them, of course, show that this is possible. But we didn't even need to do it ourselves, because we just brought the ball into the game and it was too big to ignore. And therefore, the public discourse in some sense took over. And last but not least, very classical spectrum of political organizing from, I mean, we, at the peak of collecting signatures, we had 3,000 active people. And we were present in every district, divided on the one hand into working groups, so, you know, press working group, strategic working group, tenant help working group. I mean, there's been over 10 a culture working group collaborating with, you know, with culture actors and so on. And so there was a functional organization, and then there was also regional organization. We had so-called kids teams, so the neighborhood teams that were present in every district on the ground and during the signature collection, door-to-door campaign, and we did also collaborate and created some broad coalition within Germany and internationally. Speaking of door-to-door, we definitely had some workshops with people from US who are also sharing the knowledge on the door-to-door campaign. So there's been this international aspects of urban movements, sharing the knowledge. But also within Germany, we made coalition with the tenant organization, very strong coalition with ecological movements. I mean, we had people from Fridays for Future from other German cities traveling for some weekends to help us collect signatures on the street. So a lot of solidarity from abroad. We had unions who are officially supporting us and also collecting signatures among the members. So we did also build this broad coalition. And I think in terms of mobilization, it was also important political decision, strategic decision to agree we are the one cause movement. Because if you want to build very big political power, it means you will have a lot of internal diversity. So there's no way that we will agree on every political issue. I mean, if we were striving to it, we would necessarily need it to be much smaller than we were. So the idea was we focus on this way. That's our way of doing revolution. We are this movement to expropriate housing, and we don't need to have all this other discussion if we agree on every single other political issue. And I think that was also important, and that helped us to have an internal diversity in terms of people of different age, different gender, different political backgrounds. And they carried our message to their own environments, so that we also weren't we were often accused in the media, but in fact we weren't an initiative that is just for young leftist hipsters, right, from Kreuzberg, which is this flag political district of Berlin. We had, of course, enormous amount of this demographics, but we had also all other demographics, and that was equally important that we weren't limited to it. So yeah, thank you. And I will disappear at some point soon. Sorry for that, but politics calls.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And if you have to jump out, then thank you for being with us. And we will continue. I propose, if you can, for another 10 minutes in order to answer some of the questions. We won't be able to answer all of them because some of them are very comprehensive, but at least the most pressing, most interesting questions. So, Katalin, please.
Yeah, I think I can make it, I try to make it short. I would start with the question of the, if the big companies, the corporations, if they are afraid. This was one question. Like Vonovia, and what was a reaction, and I will to answer this, I will bring in one small episode when we implemented the rent cap, the law for rent cap in Berlin. We were confronted with Moody's. Literally, Moody's said, okay, if Berlin invents this rent cap, the state is going to be downrated. And I was like, what the hell is going to happen? And I was remembered to the financial crisis in Greece and in Southern Europe, when we were confronted with Moody's all the time saying, okay, you're highly ranked or downrated and whatever. So what I wanted to say is we really have to talk about the whole financialization and its cooperations and what is going on in politics with these interactions. We really have to talk about BlackRock, that is really ruling the world, and the rating agencies that make like these questions of stock exchange is really like the key to break these chains. And it's really, really important to talk about this new politics of the financialization financial sector, which is also much more not close anymore to the bank sector, which is like a super new sector of the privatization of the renting system, the pension system, the privatization of the pensions, the privatization of the social sector in general. That is all close connected to each other. And this is really what we have to confront as the left, the financialization of all the public goods and the social system that comes to our houses with increasing rents. And this is like what we have to confront. And that's why, as long as we don't do this, we cannot think that they won't be afraid. So this is my answer to this question. And to the Greens and the Social Democrats, I can say, as long as we don't make the landlords and Vonovia and all the housing corporations, financial corporations being afraid, the Greens and the Social Democrats will not move. So it's what is happening now. The Greens are saying, okay, we want to stay in contact with the initiative and we want to talk and we want to make good vibrations, whatever. But it's not that they want really to, they are not able to say, okay, it's truly a question, a matter of the system, that it makes a difference what system we are in. And so we are like in the opposition, even we are in the government or not. So we really have to push this discourse forward. And I think, honestly, we are in the second year of the pandemic, and we see the profiteers of the big pandemic are the big corporations worldwide. And as I see that you guys in the US are talking about the expropriation of Facebook, I see this probably a new understanding of the power of these big international companies, and that we have to reorganize the economy worldwide, and we have to really socialize the economy. And this is what I'm really hoping for, that we will get like this big struggle together. And so I'm very optimistic. And we have the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation that is supporting us everywhere around the world. So big thank you.
Thank you. And that also answered a part of the other questions. I think the playground at the moment is in the parliament and in this commission that was formed, and the parliament has to actually make a law about to make this the result of the referendum reality. Still, the pressure from the movement, from the street is needed in order to keep the momentum and to keep the government going. I think that's what I take from what you said. And there's another question, and that could help me to move to Phara, because the question is, was it helpful that was on a local level, or should be much more focused to the national level. Katalin already mentioned that in what she said about the financialization and the big financial organizations, I guess. But starting on this very, in my opinion, starting on this local level, on this very pressing issue that people really feel in their lives, because everybody, as we heard, 80% of people in Berlin have to pay a rent, and it is rising. And many people cannot find an affordable apartment anymore. That helped to start the struggle and make it successful on this level. So, but maybe Phara, you want to comment on this?
Yes. Question? So it's interesting that it was framed like, where do we start with the issue of solving housing? It really does start on. It starts on the local level, like hyper local, like. Working with Know Your Rights, like it's phenomenal how many people didn't even know the status of their own agreements for rentals, right? They didn't understand that they were rent stabilized versus the market rate. So that's one level, right? When we say, where do we make the issue? And this is something that anybody can, and everybody should come together and form tenant associations, block associations, community advocacy groups. And this is where, you know, in Crown Heights, where I live, that had gotten to a point where it kind of boiled up to the point where, you know what, if we aren't getting what we want from our state, let's start replacing these people. So anybody in the greens, right? Anybody in the green level that's on the local level that's approachable, we see you walking down the block, you live in the neighborhood, you're going to answer to us, because we're going to be like, if you don't answer, you get replaced, you get primaried, you get kicked out. So that's why on the state level, it's so important for us to value the positions, get to know who is representing you on the state level, because that's how we really get the local change needed for our blocks, right? Now, there was one thing I wanted to point out. So there was whether you could regulate your rent cap, right? We can do it in New York State. We can cap rents. We can regulate the percentage of how much to rent. Funny thing, right? We can't do eminent domain, just grab up the land, but we can regulate the rent. So that's something we can do on the city level and the state level. But for us to do something like a referendum on the level which Berlin did, that would have to be the feds. The feds have to do that. And it's interesting, the constitution that was in Berlin for the 1940s, we've been rocking with the same constitution since when it was written over, 18 something. I wasn't really I didn't pay attention in political science, but it was written over. The original constitution talked about the struggle of people who were oppressed. The new constitution that was rewritten in 1800 talked about, okay, we who have money, that's us. So we really do need ultimately a new constitution too.
Wow, that's a big issue, a big task. But that's why we are leftists, because we think about the big questions. I'm sorry, there are some questions that we could not answer here, but we are already 10 minutes above our time limit. And I'd like to wrap up if nobody of the panelists really protests and says she has to say something really, really important. Then I want to thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Katalin, for presenting the situation. Thank you, Phara, for your comments and on your remarks about the situation here in the States. And we, as Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office, will continue to work on the question of right to the city and housing. So stay tuned, visit our website, rosalux.nyc, or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can also subscribe for our newsletter so that you will get alerted when we do further events on these issues and all the other interesting issues that we are working on. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to the audience for listening. Thank you to Aaron and Maria from our team for facilitating the event. And have a nice evening in Berlin, and have a good afternoon in the United States. Stay safe. Goodbye.